Sure. So we here on UBC Gay are very proud to be active supporters and advocates for minority rights. Obviously, gay rights are important to us, but there's a little known fact that I'm also black. And so we would like to argue in favor of both black and gay rights through the model that we're going to propose today, and that's that the United States government should cut funding to Black History Month unless it sufficiently recognizes the diversity of sexual preferences of their key figures. And so what we're going to be talking about essentially is there's an organization that exists that coordinates this and that is funded and subsidized through government funding within the United States. We'd say is that they will remove that funding unless we see a sufficient level of recognition, like in terms of sufficient level of recognition, at a minimum, obviously like defining the sexuality of those key figures who were like on a historical basis. Like we're not being like they wave their wrists around, right? Like key historical figures who historians agree were considered to be homosexuals or bisexual. For instance, Malcolm X, like no one knows that. So like this is really important. We don't think that like we're gonna set like exactly how they have to do, but we think it's important to recognize what their sexuality was and at least introduce some level of discourse surrounding that sexuality. We think that's really significant for 4 main reasons. First of all, I want to talk about government interest within this resolution. Secondly, I want to talk about how this is legitimate government action. Thirdly, the cycle of repression that exists specifically within black communities within the United States. And fourthly, how this is similar to active speech actively harming these communities in the omission of these sexualities. So what do we mean by government interest? We think, first and foremost, why do we fund these kinds of things, right? The government has an interest in funding things like Black History Month or Pride Week and all these things in order to attempt to combat entrenched prejudice that exists within society. We think that when we can isolate an instance in which the government funds something that is actually reinforcing those prejudices through not acknowledging the minority sexualities that existed within these key figures and that does exist within this community, we think that it is harmful and certainly subverting the process that is meant to be occurring within, that is the goal of this funding. We say that's really problematic. Yes?
Most of these figures can actually identify with label homosexual. You're imposing this on their legacy. There are different ways to identify with your sexuality. Gay acts don't make you gay necessarily.
Okay, so like we totally we agree that gay acts do not necessarily make you gay. We're saying that on a historical basis, these people at least were not straight, right? So what we're going to argue is that the status quo of like a monolithic, all of these people are straight, black people are only straight, like which really like exists within the black community, especially within West Indies Caribbean communities. We think that at least to say that there is a diversity of sexual orientations that existed is a massive benefit to these communities that are extremely repressive against those sexualities. So what else do I want to talk about? Moving on in terms of like why we fund this in terms of combating prejudice, how we don't think that how this process really is being subverted under the status quo, we say that's harmful. In addition to that, looking at the United States context, right, like a long and arduous history of repression against minority groups, right? I mean, the United States right now has like really important going to be appealed to the Supreme Court cases surrounding gay rights, right? We think this is an extremely topical issue. We think it's really important for the government to take active steps towards promoting inclusivity surrounding gay discourse, and in particular within this group, which is particularly repressive against that sexuality. We see this as a benefit and clearly within government interest. Now, why is it legitimate for the government to do this? We think, one, it's obvious that as the government's going to choose to subsidize things, that should have the right to choose which things it subsidizes, why they do that. If it doesn't think it's within their interest, that it's entirely legitimate for the government to say they don't want to fund that. But beyond that, we think that the government already often influences speech in order to, and endorses speech in order to make it favorable to the elements that are entrenched values within American society, right? So entrenched values within American society are non-discrimination, like equal accessibility, like equal rights in terms of your sexuality. We think that by doing this, we think examples of things like funding Black History Month, though it doesn't work, or funding Pride Week, or funding all those things, are things that the government should do, does do, and we think is a legitimate thing for the government to be doing. We think that this is, because of the benefits we're going to talk about, is a beneficial thing for the government to be doing, yes.
Would you want them to out people who hadn't been out about their sexuality during their life?
So we're talking about people who, on a historical basis, are known to have been, or by historians are considered to have been bisexual, gay, whatever, right? So people like Malcolm X, where it's the autobiography he wrote about himself, had nothing to do with his heterosexuality, yes, but the many, well-respected biographies that were written about him through interviews and all of that said, due to all of this research, it's very, very conclusive that this person was gay and obviously had many reasons why he was hiding it due to his relationship with the Nation of Islam, all that is obvious. So yes, it's not only is it a government interest, we also think it's legitimate government action in terms of what it's choosing to subsidize. Now, what do we see within black communities? We see a cycle of oppression, and the reason why we see that is that there's massive, massive gay stigma within these communities, right? This is endorsed through so many other cultural icons. Like we all listen to like different songs by Sean Paul, but don't hear all the ones that are like go bash gay people. Like we don't go to those clubs in Toronto where the DJ is singing, dancing, talking about how we all need to beat the Batman and like beat up gay people, right? Like this is like entrenched within black and Caribbean society, and it's extremely harmful, right? It's a very harmful discourse. We think it's extremely beneficial for the government to take positive action to try to reframe the way in which homosexuality is viewed within these communities. We see that as massively beneficial, and dissociating the fact that to be black and gay is a bad thing, that black people, like all people, have like a plurality of sexualities that should be allowed to be expressed and should feel comfortable in that expression. We see that as extremely beneficial. Beyond that, we see this as a really effective mechanism, right? So recognize that like Black History Month in and of itself is seen as an authority surrounding black discourse. But beyond that, what we would say is that like with like no key voice funded through the government or nothing being propped up to tell people that many famous black people were gay, what happens to those black individuals growing up in the United States who are gay and are stigmatized by every element of their community, right? Like I'm a young black male who's gay, and everyone, like my priests are telling me it's wrong, my cultural icons, my DJs are telling me it's wrong, Black History Month tells me no famous gay person who's been black has ever existed. What possible ability do I have to associate like anything positive with what I'm pretty sure is being black and gay? We think it's really beneficial for key figures to be identified as gay so that these individuals can see that, associate with that, and know that to be a black gay person isn't completely all right, and you can do amazing things like advocating for black rights, like someone like Malcolm X. Even though you're gay, we see that as incredibly beneficial for these youth. Finally, we think this is similar to active harm, right? So recognize that like the government obviously limits the extent to which you do speech that actively harms an individual, and we're requiring positive action in terms of speech. We think that when you omit the sexuality, that doesn't actively say that they were just straight, right? Especially within a heteronormative, extremely heteronormative discourse that exists within black Caribbean communities, right? We think that to not say what their sexuality was is to say they were straight, is to specifically deceive the people learning about these people that they were of a sexuality that is incorrect. We see that as extremely harmful. So we think it's in government interest, that it's legitimate for the government to regulate what it's subsidizing, and that this cycle of repression should be combated through positive government action. We're proud to propose.
I thank the member for this address, and I call upon the member of the opposition to oppose the case. Brent, you didn't say it.
I totally said it, Sarah.
Okay, whatever. It is time. Okay, alright, thanks. What? Okay, anyway, alright. For once, Madam Speaker, I'm really glad I went to grad school, because I actually can do this. You know, like I'm not going to make it up, it's not going to be like an IR rant. Okay, so what exactly is this case here today? And I think it's a great case, and I think we're going to have a great debate. So essentially what they're trying to have us do on side government is they're trying to have us out people who weren't necessarily outed during their lives. We're trying to make Black History Month focus on an element of people's identity that they didn't necessarily think was significant to their identity, and they're imposing a model of homosexuality, i.e. when you have gay sex, that means you're homosexual, on these people that we don't think is right, that we think is wrong, and we also think distorts a lot of these people's legacies and just distorts, you know, the world and what they think. Anyway, so first of all, what I'm going to talk to you about in my constructive is I'm going to basically, I'm going to talk to you about the possible negative externality of Black History Month not happening in a robust way. Because they said that they want the US government to withhold this funding if they don't actually out people like Malcolm X in Black History Month, or they want them to reduce the funding. I'm pretty sure it's like withhold the funding. We think that that's a negative thing because racism is so entrenched in American society. Black people still make less money. Black people are still most likely to be falsely accused, falsely executed. There's still so much racism. And yes, homosexuality is a huge idea, and being black and being homosexual do intersect. I'm not saying that they're completely different and that no black person does have gay sex. But what I'm saying is, if you don't have Black History Month at the cost of having and trying to impose integrating gay, issues about gay black people and outing gay black people, we think that that could be a really negative harm to the black community. We also think the black community who already don't vote for things like gay marriage in California and actually single-handedly tip the balance against gay marriage like tipped the ballots against voting for gay marriage in California in the referendum, you're going to make them resent the gay community more because the black community in the United States is going to be very suspicious of a gay agenda. If you ask about holes in a gay agenda, the black community overall, and I'm not saying all black people, I'm not trying to be prejudiced, guys, overall, are the most sensitive to the idea that there is a gay agenda, and that gay people are trying to impose their lifestyle on other people. And if you tell them, we have to learn about how Malcolm X, one of your most acclaimed icons, is gay, when it's even controversial, not even all historians really agree on the fact that he had gay sex or how much gay sex he had. Well, we don't think that this is going to be well received, and we think that you actually turn the black population against gay people within the black population and outside it, and you turn them against each other. We don't think this is a good thing to turn vulnerable people against each other, because it just gives more power to the white heterosexual norm in our society when you turn different groups against each other. That is one really big deal. But we also think it's just bad PR. We also think that it's wrong to impose on people an identity they didn't necessarily have. So in the black community, a lot of people who are gay don't have gay sex, and we would think we're gay, don't necessarily identify as gay. A lot of them do what they call living on the down low. So they have lives, they have families, but they engage in gay sex. And they don't consider themselves to be gay, they don't consider themselves to be part of the gay community, they don't consider themselves to have a gay identity. So to out these people and to impose homosexuality on them is kind of wrong, because what is homosexuality? Are we going to use the white normative definition of what it is? Because what is homosexuality in the United States? It was very much defined by privileged middle-class white men who decided this is an identity, we live in Greenwich Village together, we make a lot of money, we work in things like advertising, and they define the agenda. A lot of people who are working class, or a lot of people who are people of color, say, you know what, I've been so oppressed for so long, I don't really feel the need to identify as strongly with the gay community, and the sex I have doesn't necessarily define me. We think it's your right as a citizen to say that the sex you have doesn't define you. And outing people like Malcolm X is just wrong. We think that saying that, with information that he didn't want out when he wrote his own biography, to then make it, front and center in Black History Month is wrong. I'll take it.
Okay, the issue is that when you have a culture that does things like believe in the gay agenda, they have a very strong definition of what it means to be gay. By showing other examples, you dismantle that.
Okay, the issue is, when you're showing other examples of what it is to be gay, I don't think that they're going to think this came from a neutral place. I really don't think. I think they're going to be very suspicious of this, because you're saying not just that we encourage you to unearth these people's sexuality, but we mandate that you do. You have no other option, or we take away Black History Month. We think that seems like a conspiracy to a lot of people, and we think that if these people don't want to have, don't want to talk about Malcolm X's sexuality, we think that that is really negative in terms of the fact that Black History Month will disappear, and you need to have that education in schools about Black people and how they still face challenges. You need to have that because you need sensitivity training so that people don't think it's okay to discriminate against Black people, so they know why they sometimes face more hardships in society and sometimes are more likely to live in poor areas. It's not because they had it coming, it's because they've been oppressed for centuries and only recently really meaningfully got the right to vote in the 20th century. Just because you have a Black president doesn't mean the work is done and we can just focus on gay rights, Mr. Speaker. So I've done a lot of implicit refutation, and now I'm going to do some explicit refutation. So basically what they're worried about is reinforcing prejudices and the idea that no one in the gay community and no one in the Black community is gay. And I've told you sort of Foucauldian analysis that sex acts don't equate to sexual identity. That's a very 20th century idea, that just because you have gay sex, that makes you gay. And for people who didn't identify as part of the gay community, to then say that they identified as the gay part of the gay community and felt they were queer and read a lot of Judith Butler is wrong, and that's not what actually happened. And it also distracts from the legacy they wanted to have. Because Malcolm X, all he wanted you to know in his biography is that he did a lot of activism for Black people, because a lot of people who are both gay and Black say that being Black affects more than being gay in society, that they think racism is more profound. So it's absolutely his right to emphasize his Blackness. We think that that's fine, and we think that that's okay. We also think it's okay for Black History Month to focus entirely on race. We think you can have a Queer History Month where you talk about queers of color. We think you can do that, but we think that it's okay for Black History Month to say we're focusing on this one discrete problem. We recognize intersectionality happens, but we don't want to distract from this issue in this specific month because racism is still so rampant. So we think that that's okay. We also think the idea that because there is a lot of homophobia in the Black community, to force it on them is not a good idea. We think maybe you can incentivize this. We think maybe you can give money to people who are doing research on Black people who identified as gay. We think you can do that. But to force this kind of change is just going to make them resent gay communities and be even more homophobic. Yes, there might be rap songs that say we should bash all the gays. That's hate speech, Madam Speaker. The fact that that's not enforced is not the problem of the Black community. It's the problem of, I guess, white police officers who don't want to charge them, or Black police officers who don't want to charge them, but whatever. It's the problem with the law. Charge these people with hate speech. You don't have to force them to talk about the fact that Malcolm X was gay. Because as far as I'm concerned, there's not a lot lot of denial about the fact that he was gay. I mean, they just don't talk about it, actually, is what the inside government seems to say. And, you know, they just assume that he's heterosexual because we live in a heteronormative society, which is true. But the fact is, Malcolm X wanted his legacy to emphasize his race activism. He wanted that, and there's 1 month of the year that emphasizes race problems and race activism. We say, don't force it to change, and don't force it to change in this way, especially because this is not an organic change, and we think it'll exacerbate a lot of problems. For all these reasons, this is opposed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, let's be very, very clear. We're not saying that Black History Month should become Gay Black History Month. What we're saying is that when you have things like a biography from Malcolm X, which is printed on, which is posted on the Black History Month website, it should maybe mention the fact that he had sex with men, because it does mention a number of his relationships with women, right? It's not like Black History Month, when they talk about individuals within Black history, are talking about individuals in a vacuum of sexuality. They talk about heterosexuality. We say that they should have to talk about homosexuality too. So I'm going to expand on a few of the points that Josh brought up, and then I'm going to clash with what we heard from Sarah. So I want to talk about the way that the discourse in Black History Month functions, and how we think that this affects societal attitudes towards gayness, towards blackness. I also want to talk to you about the fact that I think that racism is related to heterosexism, and that you can't separate them necessarily. All right, so Black History Month is really, really weird, because we'd say it's an aspect of internal cultural discourse, as well as external cultural discourse and representation of a culture to groups of people in the rest of society. So if you look at the internal discourse, it's strange because internal cultural discourse tends to be organic. But Black History Month is this weird paternalistic structure which provides definitional authority on aspects of Black culture, right? There's a structure which tells Black people what it means to be Black. And so we think that when you have a structure like this, which functions in the Black community as sort of an authority on what your accomplishments are, as a people throughout history, which is denying the accomplishments of certain individuals and denying parts of the community, right? I mean, there are gay jazz musicians whose name I can't remember, who are not included in the Black History Month website, despite being as significant to Black music as various other jazz musicians. They're just not mentioned at all, right? We think that's a problem when you ignore an entire aspect of your community, or you ignore an entire sort of struggle against discrimination that certain individuals within that community have. So we also think that there's a similar role that it plays when dealing with the external representation of the community, right? Because the way that people perceive a cultural community, we think is enhanced if they have a more full view of what that community is. We think in terms of when you're trying to combat racism, what you're really trying to do is dismantle the structure of white paternalism which exists in society, right? We think that heterosexism is a part of that to the same extent that racism is. We think that you really can't get away from racism without also getting away from heterosexism, without also getting away from sexism at the same time, because we say those are all necessary features of the same structure, right? So we think it's really important that you treat those things as something which is interrelated, because we say that's the way that it actually works in society. Yeah, Sarah.
Why do we need to force the Black people to do it this way, though? Why can't they decide how to help themselves and how to educate people about their own plight organically?
Right, I think that organic discourse is a very good thing. I've already talked to you about the way that Black History Month functions, right? It is a paternalistic form of cultural discourse, right? Furthermore, it is a paternalistic form of cultural discourse which is funded by the government. So we think the government has an interest in making sure that when they're funding something which is meant to combat racism, etc., 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 that the government actually can control the content in a way which they think is meaningful, right? So we think that that's why it's okay for the government to step in this situation, and in this way, I've just finished answering one. Wait a minute, and that's why we are happy with that. Okay, so what did we hear coming out of Sarah's speech? Now, she told us about like the negative externality of like possibly losing Black History Month or having people like not like Black History Month as much. Like, we'd say that there is a significant harm to just like, to having Black History Month exist in the way that it does, right? Like, we'd say that by like leaving, like, by omitting homosexual figures or the homosexuality of figures, like, from Black history, reinforces like a lot of heterosexist discourse within the Black community, and in a certain way prevents that from happening because people do treat these information sources as like authorities on Black culture or like on what their attitude should be towards certain things, right? So when you have the authority that people are turning to, like reinforcing these notions of heterosexism, we think that's really bad, right?
Kevin.
So like, we think that, you know, we're willing to swallow that positive negative externality to turn Black History Month as sort of an institution into something which is like functional and actually aids in like promoting what we would say is like a healthy cultural discourse, a discourse which is like opposed to institutions of discrimination. So the next thing that Sarah said was like, she was like postmodernism was all over the debate. It was just like, you know, like sexuality doesn't exist. Like, that's like an incredibly like white conception of what it means to be homosexual. Like, yeah, so like sexual identities are stigmatized within the Black community, but so are like sex acts, right? So I'm not saying that we're necessarily like, Malcolm X was gay, he read a lot of Judith Butler. Like, what we're saying is like, Malcolm X is a dude who like liked to sleep with other dudes sometimes. Like, that's cool to recognize. Like, we don't think that that does anything more than like state the facts, right? And we think that when you do have like structures of discrimination are based very much on like monolithic conceptions of what it means to do a certain thing. We think that when you provide counterexamples like Malcolm X, who like is respected, right? People aren't going to stop respecting Malcolm X because it's like highly publicized that he's like bisexual. If anything, they're going to change their attitude towards like bisexuality and how that interacts with a person's identity. Like, we think that's a really good thing. We think that, you know, when you provide these counterexamples, you do start to like dismantle conceptions of like how these actions interact with an identity. We think that's like a really important thing to do, right? So then like the rest of her speech was mostly just like, it's okay to just focus on race. We need something which just focuses on race. Like what I told you in my speech is like, I think it's impossible to just focus on race. Like I don't think race is an isolated issue. I think when you're dealing with figures who are like representing Black history, which are like people who have overcome discrimination, right? People who have had to process minority identities, like within like a broader like societal framework of discrimination, right? We think that it is very important, like what those struggles were in relation to sexuality and race, because we think that changes the dynamic of like the racial discrimination, right? And we think it also allows people to see things like the fact that when you discriminate against gay people, like you are participating in a structure which is similar to the structure which discriminates against you as a Black person, right? So we think that's important to recognize. We don't think you can separate these things, and we think that the government should cut funding if they try to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. So I have two more points of constructive into which I'm going to weave much of my rebuttal, but I will also go line by line. And I want to start, before I get into that constructive, with a few of the practical problems with this model. And like Josh already ate some of them, but I'm going to give him another helping, because like I don't think that they go away as easily as he might say that they would. Because what Sarah told you, right, is that it will just be practically very, very difficult to define who is or is not gay, what constitutes what is or is not gay. But moreover, we actually just think that there is some difficulty in determining on the basis of a historical record whether or not people engaged in homosexual acts. There is a current controversy about whether Abraham Lincoln was or was not either gay or did not have sex with other men. And we think that the actual process by which these are adjudicated is difficult to be determined and is probably best left to historians at a university than government policymakers, right? Like we just think that it's problematic for the government to force the organizers of Black History Month to sort of say that somebody did or did not have, sexual relations, homosexual, sex acts, when they may or may not have, right? When these are questions of, when they are, in fact, a source of controversy, right? Whether or not they are correct. So like we would say on our side of the house that like, maybe they're only talking about the clearest of all clear-cut cases, but we think that those are few and far between, right? And that members of the black community and other members of various historical communities are very likely to contest this as a legitimate and official version of history. Which brings me to my first point, which is, should we tie government funding to a kind of government-sanctioned histories? No thanks, Evan. Because, like, I won't lie to you, Madam Speaker, I spent the first 7 minutes of this debate trying to figure out what, like, Black History Month had to do with, like messaging about gay black people. Like, I just don't understand what one has to do with the other. Like, we think we want to promote, like, we want to promote positive portrayals of black historical figures, and we also want to promote positive portrayals of gay people. And like in an ideal world, like I guess we would have both, like maybe at the same time, but maybe not. But like here's our problem, right? Is why is one contingent on the other? Why do we take one group who is doing something that we all agree is important, right? We think that Black History Month is important. We want to support it. We want to promote it, right? So why do we take what we think is important and then make upon that contingent, an acceptance of something that the people who are organizing it don't want to accept, something they may not be convinced is legitimate, and moreover, why do we make them accept something that may not actually be legitimate, like that may be historically controversial? Like we think that that's problematic. Because we think that one of two things are going to happen. I'll take you now.
Okay, Brent, the problems that you're listing with like historical controversy are just problems with biography in general. It doesn't mean that we should stop publishing.
Okay, but the problem is that all right. So there's a controversy. Like, did or did not Malcolm X have sex with other men, right? But what you're saying is that the government is going to adjudicate that, right? The government is going to decide definitively that Malcolm X had sex with other men. They are going to decide that he was in fact a homosexual, and they're going to force members of the black community to accept that he was a homosexual, or else they'll lose federal funding. Like, that's the problem. We think that that's what's illegitimate, right? Is for the government to adjudicate these kind of historical things and then to force them down people's throats. And that's how it is going to be perceived. Because we think that the rational response of the organizers of Black History Month is one of two things. Either they're going to, we think the most likely thing is that they'll just forego federal funds. Like, if they believe strongly enough that they don't want their idols to be, delegitimized in their own view or in the view of other black Americans, we think that they'll just forego federal funds, in which case we end up with a worse Black History Month that is less promoted, less successful. We think that that's a net harm. But we think that even if they accept the federal funds, then we're forcing them to accept a view that they themselves believe is illegitimate. And we think that that's equally problematic, right? Like, we think that it's problematic to force people to accept a view that has no actual basis in law, that is merely a political opinion, right? They are forcing people to simply say, these people were gay and we think that that's great, when in actual fact, we think that it's totally legitimate for them to say that it is in fact not great. Right? We don't think it's great for people to say that being gay is not good, but there's no law that says that you can't say that. In actual fact, there's a law that says that you can say that, right? We think that people have the right to self-expression in the United States. People should have the right to take these views that are mainly not popular, and we don't think necessarily that we should make access to federal funding contingent on accepting, these various political propositions. And I want to kind of draw an analogy, right? Because in various U.S. southern states, there are laws on the books that require providers of abortions to give women information about the risks of abortion and the medical risks of abortion. And we think that there's a lot of controversy about whether this evidence or whether this instruction that they are required to give women is medically sound, is appropriate, whether or not they should be, but they're required to. And we think that that's illegitimate, right? We shouldn't require people who are providing a service that we think is necessary and important to give a message that may or may not be correct, that they may or may not agree with, or otherwise we defund them. We think that by example, Madam Speaker, we don't require, Catholic schools in the United States, many of which receive federal funding because we think the education of Catholics is important. We don't require them to teach about gay Catholics. We don't make that a requirement of them, Madam Speaker, because we think that it's just good to educate people, and if we want to promote a view that is positive of gay people, there are other fora to do it. But to link one to the other is problematic. I'm moving on to my second point, which is about the political ramifications of this. And I think Josh is right. There are elements in the gay community that are very hostile to the concept of homosexuality in general and homosexuality within the gay community. But I think that really that is just one part of the black community, and maybe it's as pervasive as Josh tells you. But what we're going to tell you on our side of the house is it is much better to promote an organic dialogue within the community and to promote those members of the community that hold less extreme views, the people that are willing to stand up in church groups, the people who are willing to be positive community activists, rather than forcing it down people's throats, right? We think that that's problematic because all it does is get people's backs up. Because whereas they hope to create a dialogue about it, we think that dialogue is going to be either begrudging, so it's going to be buried somewhere on the website and no one will ever see it, or we think what's going to happen is that dialogue is going to be overwhelmingly negative. Because I think that the message that they're really sending to the black community is this. Either you have to forego these funds if you want to believe what you really believe, and therefore, it's just a slap in the face to black Americans, or they have to begrudgingly accept this. In which case the message is that the white minority is going to basically declare many of your idols, many of the leaders of your civil rights movement are gay, and you have to tell people that they're gay, which is something that within the community delegitimizes them, right? We think that the message that this sends, that all of your leaders, or not all of them, but certainly some of them are gay, forces them into kind of an impossible choice, where either they have to accept a view that they don't accept as legitimate, or they have to forego federal funds. The other thing I don't think they showed you in this debate was that there was a necessary link between discussion of gay members of the black community and the advancements of rights for actual members of the gay community. Like, I don't know how this discussion actually furthers their rights, because members of the black community are very, very hostile to it. The reason that Prop 8 was ultimately repealed was largely on the strength of black voters in California who overwhelmingly voted against it. We think that when you ultimately make these kinds of things that are viewed as an imposition, particularly on the black community, right? Because other faith communities or other racial minorities may not be required to acknowledge these things. We think that all this does is harden opposition and make it more difficult. So moving into some refutation of what we got from side government, the first thing they say is that the government's interest is the promotion of rights, and obviously, like, we agree with this. But we think that the way in which they do this is to promote, positive social messaging about gay people, not to be sort of revisionist historians, right? Like, we think it doesn't at all advance the rights of gay people for the government to definitively just conclude that Malcolm X was gay. We think that what actually advances gay rights in the United States is for the government to say that gay people are citizens, that they should have rights, that we should advance their rights, and we should respect them, right? We don't think that it matters at all whether or not Malcolm X was gay, and we don't think that that actually will help the cause if the government forces people to accept that Malcolm X was gay. Otherwise, they'll remove money from black history. We think that that hurts both the black community and the gay community. They said that we want to combat prejudice, and we think that, like, we agree, we just don't think that this is the right way to do it. We think that the way that you actually change minds is by empowering moderates and by empowering people who have actual standing, who have actual legitimacy within the black community, rather than just people who are forced to kind of put a disclaimer on the website, right? And, like, it's just not clear to me. Like, they've asserted that silence is the same as denial, right? And I think that it's important for me to draw this distinction, because it's not clear to me that not talking about, the sex life of various civil rights leaders is the same as denying that they were homosexuals outright. Like, it's just not clear to me at all that the Black History Month is the appropriate forum to require discussion of the sex life, of either heterosexuality or homosexuality or bisexuality or transsexuality of, like, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Like, it's just not clear to me that one should be tied to the other. Then they talk about this idea that it's legitimate for government to choose the ways in which it spends money. Like, okay, fair enough. But what we would say in response to that is that it's not legitimate to require people to adopt your version of politics, your version of history, in order to have any access to federal funds. We don't require Catholics in order to get federal funds to accept that there are gay Catholics and to actively teach that, right? We just accept that they're teaching people, we think that's good, we give them money for it, right? If they're doing something that's good that we like, we should give them money for it. If we think that there is a group that wants to have Pride Week, we should also accept that that's good and give them money for it. They have never shown you why one needs to be tied to the other. Then they say, well, black communities are very hostile to homosexuality. We've said that all you do is harden it, right? All you do is harden this opposition, because ultimately what happens is that people, perceive that this is an imposition. They perceive that they are being told by the minority that they have to accept this, otherwise they'll lose their money. We think that this is a very dangerous message. The last thing I want to talk about is heterosexism necessarily related to racism? Like, what is the nexus between Black History Month and sexuality? And we just don't think that there is one, right? I mean, heterosexism pervades all races. It is pervasive throughout our society. We don't think it is necessarily more pernicious in the black community. And moreover, we would tell you that ultimately the best thing to do is to empower moderates, to encourage dialogue, and to continue to fund Black History Month. Thank you.
Someone can you give me a second? But I'm really bad at it. Ready? Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about the actual impact of this resolution. I want to talk about the identity of these icons, and I want to talk about why we're choosing Black History Month. And the first thing I want to say is that we've seen really no engagement with the fact that the government has a categorical, should have a categorical opposition to the current existence of Black History Month, and in and of itself, it shouldn't be funding it if it disagrees, right? We think that if you have something that is encouraging repressive discourse, we don't think the government should be providing money to that, and we think the government's entirely legitimate in doing that. We don't think that that's been engaged with at all. Now, what do I want to look at? First of all, in terms of what is the impact of this resolution? They argue that we're not going to see Black History Month, and that we're going to see a further entrenchment of racism. I think Evan provides you really convincing analysis as to how racist things and other forms of repressive discourse are intimately linked, right? You look at the introduction of a book by Paul Gilroy called Against Race, and it says specifically, right, if racists and people who perpetuate attacks against minority races are perpetuating attacks against gays, against every other minority that is repressed by the same structure that is against these minorities, right? We think that these things are intimately linked. We think the government has to recognize the association and fight a battle in which it recognizes that association and does so in an effective way. We do not think that to only have a queer history month or whatever is going to acknowledge the fact that these things are associated, that you have the same people benefiting from this repression, and that we need to attack this on a holistic sense. Beyond that, they talk about how there's status quo harm of government kind of reinforcement of repressive discourse greater than, yeah, so even if people engage less with Black History Month, we think that the status quo harm perpetuated by government funding for Black History Month, which has so many harms in society, should be removed, right? So if people are going to watch Black History Month less, we think that's good under the status quo because we think it's a damaging form of discourse, so we think that's fine. We think it needs to be restructured and is only beneficial when reframed in the way that we want it to. Finally, Brent tells us that it's hard to determine whether or not people were gay, right? So he tells us there's controversy surrounding whether or not Lincoln was gay. We should acknowledge the controversy. If on a historical basis we're not sure if Malcolm X was gay, then at least mention that we're not sure if he was gay, rather than the omission which really does insert the fact that he must have been straight. Beyond that, if it's about history, historical fact is what did these people do? If over the course of a decade he was having sex with men, it's not even necessarily we need to say that he was gay. It's just these are things that are omitted because they're homophobic. We think all these things make greater historical accuracy and a much more positive discourse surrounding homosexuality within the Black community. I think that's all important. Beyond that, he said maybe only a couple were gay. That's fine. When you talk about trailblazing and young Black youth being able to look to figures, you only really need a couple to know that it's not necessary that all Black people were not gay ever. In terms of the icon's identity, right? Malcolm X can still emphasize race. We're talking about Black History Month. It's the first word. It's going to be a focus on race. We think it's really important to associate race with sexual plurality. We think that's beneficial under the under the model that we're arguing for, right? And these people might not want these identities to be disclosed, but we think it's important for all those hidden, repressed identities of Black youth in the United States to be actualized through the recognition of prominent gay Black figures. Finally, why Black History Month? Because it's not Black History Month now, and we deny the actual organic history of Blacks within the United States. We said it's damaging for all these reasons. We said proudly and properly.